The economy has been hammered by the coronavirus-induced crisis, as lockdowns and restrictions instituted to fight the spread of COVID-19 reduced government revenues and reduced economic growth. The 3.632 trillion shillings budget proposes to strike a balance between stimulating economic recovery and responding to the health challenges the pandemic brought in its wake. A total of 26.6 billion shillings is earmarked for the post-COVID-19 economic stimulus program. At the same time, 135.3 billion shillings will go into the President's Big Four agenda, covering universal healthcare, food and nutrition, manufacturing and affordable housing. In the proposed budget, the Executive, Parliament and the Judiciary have been allocated 1.879 trillion shillings, 37 billion shillings and 17 billion shillings respectively, as contained in the 2021 Budget Policy Statement approved by Parliament earlier this year. The Finance Bill 2021, on its part, seeks to amend the Income Tax, the VAT Act, the Excise Duty Act, the Tax Procedures Act, the Miscellaneous Fees and Levies Act, as well as the Capital Markets Act, the Central Depositories Act, the Kenya Revenue Authority Act, the Insurance Act, and the Retirement Benefits Act, to facilitate realization of the budget proposals. Treasury is proposing to introduce VAT exemptions on ventilators, decongestants, and supplements in order to boost the health sector by lowering costs. In a bid to support youth employment, there is a proposal on tax deductions for employers that engage in technical and vocational education and training graduates as apprentices. There are also several amendments to enhance tax administration and dispute resolution operations. These proposals, alongside others contained in the Finance Act, will help create the legal and policy framework to achieve the medium-term budget goals. Brenda Kirubo, KTN News.
All right, definitely. Next week on Thursday, all eyes will be on Ukur Yatani, the CS for Treasury, as he reads the budget for Kenyans. But there's still a lot of concern about that budget. We shall also be looking at the losers and gainers for this year's budget, the budget for financial year 2021-2022. So I bring in my guests in studio. I'm joined by my colleague, Dominic Omondi, who's a writer with the Standard newspaper, and also joining us virtually this morning for that conversation is Abraham Rugo from the IBP. Gentlemen, good morning, and thank you for joining us here on KTN News Center. And so this year, actually next week, all eyes will be on Treasury. So we are talking about a budget that will cost the country 3 trillion shillings. This is way higher than the budget for the financial year 2020-2021. So let me begin with Mr. Abraham.
Thank you so much. The fact that the budget is larger than the previous year is, it's an obvious fact because costs are incremental. But I think what is of concern is that this is a budget that is happening at a season that is not your normal season. The season being that we are not really out of the COVID-19 crisis, particularly as concerns people's incomes, household incomes, and the general performance of the economy, which has to do with the amount of revenue that can be generated from the economy, the amount of business that is happening. And therefore, the CS has a big duty to try and balance what we call the drivers of the economy, so things that basically will bring in productivity, but also the social protection that is critical to be able to support people who are not vulnerable but now have fallen into vulnerability because of loss of jobs. As you know, about 2 million, the latest reports we have is just about 2 million jobs have been lost. About a third of the small and medium enterprises, businesses have been closed. And therefore, those are incomes. So balancing that social protection side, which means spending more, versus how much you can actually be able to generate from the economy in the way of tax collection. I think that's the big balancing act, and we'll be discussing much more in this conversation.
And Dominic, Mr. Abraham brings in a very important point in terms of balancing, this budget, in terms of even the revenue collection, because as we speak, Treasury has only collected 1 trillion, which is way less than what the country needs to finance the budget. As much as the government is trying to fund this budget, wananchi are going to suffer. Taxes are being raised on basic commodity. Taxes are being raised on motorbikes. Taxes are going to be raised on some medical equipment.
So, Brenda, thank you. And that's a very interesting question, not just for this budget, but every other budget. We've been having this balancing act. And the issue, if I remember well, there's a session I attended with the IMF, and what they called it, it's an African issue when it comes to budget financing, and they call it a trilemma, you know. So you have countries who have deficit in terms of infrastructure, for example. They need a lot of development, and so they need to pump a lot of money into development projects. But there's also a problem with, one, they have a problem with debt. They can't go and borrow so much, but they also have a problem. You can't tax so much. And if you realize that the two ways in which a government can raise money for its spending needs is through either taxation or through taking loans. But here is a problem that is even compounded by a COVID-19 crisis, which means, one, you have to help people who have been devastated in terms of losing jobs. You have a health crisis that needs to be addressed. People need to be tested. People need to be vaccinated and all that. That means you need a lot of money to basically try and stimulate the economy. But how do you do it in an economy where the revenues are, people have lost jobs? How do you raise taxes? And how do you do it in an environment where, basically you've run out of space for borrowing? You saw the issues that we had with IMF, people, taking to the street. I mean, bombarding the IMF social media platforms and saying that they're tired of the loans that the government has been taking. So it's going to be a really delicate balancing act, as Rugo has put it.
But then, before I bring in Mr. Rugo, Dominic, I mean, when you look at the gainers for this year's budget, the losers and the gainers, the gainers of the financial year 2021-2022 is more on development, infrastructure development, yet Kenyans need to put food on their table. Kenyans need employment.
Yeah, and that's one of the problems that we've always been having. Our expenditure has been heavy on infrastructure, big projects. I mean, you talk of your SGR, you talk of your Lamu Port, you talk of, there's the Huduma Namba, which is one of the programs that is going to absorb quite some significant funds. But you have problems, you have Kenyans whose problem is basically your normal, how do I get my next meal? How do I get money? How do I get a job and all that? And this is an area that probably the government hasn't been very good at addressing in terms of how it's been doing its financing. Most economists will tell you that we've relied more on what they call the trickle-down economics. So you do your infrastructure, and you probably incentivize big corporations and hope that that money will then trickle down to Wanjiku and they'll be able to get jobs. But that doesn't seem to be working. You remember we've been having this debate about how, well, you have your GDP, which is growing, but people can't eat GDP. People need food on the table. So this is probably one of those periods when really that is going to be put to test as to whether the big expenditures that we are going to have is going to translate into improved standard of living and people being able to put food on the table.
All right. So Mr. Rugo, we are taxing Kenyans more to fund development projects. Yet it's good what Dominic has explained in terms of what Kenyans really want. But when I look at the budgetary alignments, for the financial year 2021-2022, it's coming at a time of reduced revenue collection and exposing the country to another financial year of ballooning debt, because now we're going to borrow to fund this budget, yet we have debts that we also need to pay as a country.
Yeah, so first of all, let me correct that the amount of money that we collect domestically is all absorbed in what you would call our recurrent expenses. A big portion of it is, taken by that, and therefore there are much money that we borrow. In fact, if the financial year 2021-2022 is anything to go by, the amount of money that is allocated to just running the national executive, parliament and judiciary, which you rightly noted, 1.8 trillion for the executive, 37 for judiciary, for parliament, and 17 for the judiciary, is actually more than what is anticipated to be collected in annual tax revenue, which is about 1.7. And if you add the projections, the other changes. So in other words, all the money that we collect largely will go to running the government in terms of the day-to-day. Let me come to the question of debt. Because what is happening is that basically we are running our great expenditures on debt, because the big problem has been that year on year the deficit has been growing, and we have raised this in our memorandum that we sent as the International Budget Partnership in conjunction with the 70 other organizations to Parliament. We have asked them to not accept the revised deficit, which pushes the deficit from about 900 billion to about 1.6 trillion. So in other words, in the last 3 years, our deficit has more than doubled from about 6% of GDP to about 13%. Now, because the deficit is so big, what it means is that, and the deficit is basically the difference between how much you anticipate to collect in terms of revenue and how much you plan to spend. And then also because of COVID, already you rightly noted, we are falling short by almost 350 billion in collections for this financial year alone. And any analyst knows very well that the greatest effects of what COVID has done will be felt in 2021 going in 2022, not to mention we have elections coming next year and the shocks that introduces into the economy. And therefore, we are basically running a debt-driven kind of budget. And the only way to fix that, at least for now, so that then we can be able to redirect the monies where they need to be, is basically be able to cut the deficit, because once you cut the deficit, everything else takes care of itself.
But then, Mr. Rugo, we're about to take a commercial break, but I'd just like to pick your mind on this. Yes, we know that. How then are we going to fund this budget? Because you know that Parliament is not ready to allow Treasury to borrow more than 7.5% of the country's economic output to plug the budget shortfall in the financial year starting July 1st.
So as I've said, you see, Parliament is both our help and sometimes also our letdown. Because Parliament did approve the budget policy statement with the deficit I've said. We are waiting to see whether Parliament will actually approve the deficit that is basically been increased in this current budget. You remember that the borrowing amount basically has already been set at 9 trillion. The desire by Treasury was to raise it to 12 trillion. So my thinking is that the only way forward as far as this is concerned is cut the deficit, because unless you are planning for things you don't intend to do, because you know very well and very clearly you don't have money. The second thing is that a lot of the spending, particularly in healthcare, is still not on vaccines, is still not on dealing with the health side of COVID. It's actually on infrastructure side of building, basically building more facilities, which I don't think is a priority right now. What we need right now is get people vaccinated so that they can go back to work, so that the economy, we can stop these, knee-jerk reactions of people go back, then you close again, people go back, then you close again. And yet we know very well that vaccination is one of the ways in which you can get the economy moving. So basically, it's move money from things that you don't need right now and put it into things that can reopen economy and people's activity in it, so that then we can move forward.
All right, but is the government ready to remove money from things to use, stop using money from things that they don't need? That's a discussion that we'll continue having after the short commercial break I'm taking right now here on KTN News Center. So do keep it KTN News.
This is KTN News.